There's a point in relationships with avoidance where something fundamental shifts inside you, where the emotional investment that kept you tethered finally releases, where the hope that sustained you through cycles of withdrawal and return finally exhausts itself. This point of no return isn't marked by anger or dramatic decision. It's quieter than that, more final than that. It's the internal moment when you recognize that you're done, not because you've decided to be done, but because you simply are done. When the relationship that once consumed your thoughts and energy becomes something you observe with detachment rather than desperation. This point is significant because it's often irreversible. Unlike the many times you've been hurt and reconsidered the relationship before, this shift represents a psychological crossing where you've emotionally divested in ways that can't be undone simply because the avoidant finally decides to show up differently. Understanding the signs that you've reached this point of no return is crucial because it helps you recognize when you're not just temporarily frustrated or hurt, but genuinely finished, when staying or giving another chance would be forcing something that's already ended internally, regardless of external relationship status. These signs aren't about the avoidance behavior. They're about your internal transformation, about what's changed in how you experience the relationship, how you think about the avoidant, how you've restructured your life and emotional landscape in ways that no longer accommodate their patterns. Recognizing these signs helps you honor your own growth rather than doubting it when the avoidant inevitably returns after sensing your genuine distance. It helps you trust that your disengagement is wisdom rather than giving up. It helps you understand that some endings aren't failures, but rather natural conclusions that arrive when you finally valued yourself enough to stop accepting what doesn't serve you. You've stopped caring whether they show up or not. The first and perhaps most definitive sign that you've reached the point of no return is when you've stopped caring whether the avoidant shows up or not, when their presence or absence no longer significantly impacts your emotional state. When you've released the desperate need for them to finally be consistent and have accepted with complete neutrality that they are who they are and it no longer matters to your well-being. This shift from caring intensely to not caring is profound because it represents the death of hope, the end of investment, the completion of a grieving process that's allowed you to let go of the relationship emotionally, even if it hasn't ended officially. The point of no return has been reached because you've moved beyond hurt into indifference, beyond disappointment into acceptance, beyond fighting for the relationship into peaceful disengagement. This not caring manifests, first, in your lack of emotional reaction when the avoidant withdraws. Previously, their distance triggered anxiety, hurt, desperate attempts to understand what you did wrong or how to bring them back. But now when they withdraw, you barely notice. You don't check your phone constantly hoping for their message. You don't replay interactions looking for what triggered their distance. You don't feel the anxious knot in your stomach wondering when they'll re-engage. Their withdrawal is simply information. They've withdrawn again, as they always do. But it's information that doesn't move you emotionally. You continue with your life unchanged because their absence no longer creates a void you need to fill or a problem you need to solve. The not caring also appears in your response when the avoidant does show up. Previously, their return after distance created relief, hope, renewed investment in the relationship's potential. But now, their presence generates the same neutrality as their absence. You're not excited they've returned. You're not relieved they've reached out. You're not hopeful this means things will be different. You respond politely, if you respond at all, but without the emotional engagement that characterized your previous interactions. The avoidance presence used to feel like sunshine after rain. Now it's just weather, neither particularly good nor particularly bad, just a condition that exists without significantly affecting your internal experience. This shift to not caring includes releasing the mental and emotional energy you used to spend on the avoidant. You're no longer analyzing their behavior, trying to decode their patterns, working to understand what triggers their withdrawal or what brings them close. You're not discussing them constantly with friends. You're not reading articles about avoidant attachment, trying to figure out how to reach them. You're not planning strategies for how to maintain their interest or meet their needs. The mental space they occupied, which was considerable, often consuming, has been freed up and redirected towards yourself. Your goals, your genuine interests. The avoidant has become peripheral to your mental landscape rather than central to it. The not caring also manifests in your lack of investment in their growth or change. Previously, you may have held hope that they'd work on their patterns, that they'd go to therapy, that they'd eventually develop capacity for the consistency you needed. You tracked signs of change, celebrated small improvements, maintained belief that transformation was possible if you were just patient enough. But now you don't care whether they change or not. Their growth or lack of growth is their business, not yours. You're not invested in their journey because you've accepted that their journey doesn't need to involve you, that their patterns are their responsibility to address or not address, that their transformation or lack thereof doesn't affect your decisions about your own life and well-being. This shift includes not caring whether the relationship continues or ends. Previously, the threat of ending felt catastrophic, something to avoid at significant cost to yourself. You accommodated, suppressed your needs, accepted less than you wanted, all to maintain the relationship. But now you're genuinely indifferent to whether you stay together or break up. Both options feel acceptable. Neither feels particularly compelling. You'd be fine continuing with things as they are, which is to say, you'd be fine with minimal investment in a relationship that doesn't meet your needs, because you've stopped expecting or needing it to, and you'd be equally fine with ending it entirely. This indifference is the opposite of the intense emotional investment that characterized earlier stages of the relationship, and it signals that the connection that once felt vital now feels optional at best, irrelevant at worst. The not caring also appears in your genuine ability to imagine and accept a future without them. Previously, when you tried to imagine life without the avoidant, it felt empty, wrong, like a future you were accepting as punishment rather than choosing with peace. But now, when you imagine your future, the avoidant's presence or absence doesn't significantly alter the picture. You see yourself happy, fulfilled, engaged with life, regardless of whether they're in it. You can envision finding someone else, can imagine being single and satisfied, can picture various futures, and none of them require the avoidant's participation. This ease with imagining life without them reveals that they're no longer essential to your conception of your own future, that you've already emotionally prepared for and accepted a life that doesn't include them. The point of no return has been reached because caring, even caring enough to be angry or hurt, requires emotional investment, and you've completed the process of divestment. The avoidant might interpret your not caring as playing games, as a strategy to make them pursue, as temporary coldness that will thaw if they make the right moves. But this isn't strategy. It's genuine transformation where you've moved beyond the relationship emotionally, where what they do or don't do no longer affects you significantly, where you've released them from mattering to you in ways that can't be undone simply by them deciding to suddenly show up consistently. The not caring is final because it's not a decision you're making. It's a state you've arrived at after exhausting all the care you had to give. After investing everything and receiving insufficient return, after finally accepting that this relationship can't provide what you need, and that acceptance doesn't hurt anymore, it just is. Their patterns no longer hurt. They just inform your decisions. The second sign you've reached the point of no return is when the avoidance patterns no longer cause emotional pain, but instead simply provide information that informs your decisions about how to proceed. Previously, each withdrawal hurt. Each instance of inconsistency created wounds. Each moment of emotional unavailability felt like rejection that you internalized. But now their patterns are data rather than devastation, evidence rather than injury, information about their capacity that you receive neutrally and use practically to make choices that serve your well-being. The shift from experiencing their behavior as painful to experiencing it as informative represents a fundamental change in your relationship to the avoidant and signals that you've achieved the psychological distance necessary for the point of no return. This transformation manifests in how you interpret their withdrawal. Previously, when the avoidant created distance, you interpreted it personally. You did something wrong, you were too much, you pushed them away. Their withdrawal triggered self-doubt, anxiety about your worthiness, desperate attempts to figure out what you could do differently. But now, when they withdraw, you interpret it accurately. They're uncomfortable with intimacy, they're triggered by closeness. They're operating from attachment wounds that have nothing to do with you. Their withdrawal is information about their patterns, not information about your value. This reframing from personal to informational removes the emotional charge from their behavior. It still tells you something important, but what it tells you is about them rather than about you. The patterns informing decisions rather than causing hurt also appears in how you respond to their inconsistency. Previously, their unpredictable availability created constant anxiety, kept you in a state of hypervigilance about their mood and availability, made you adjust your entire life trying to accommodate their fluctuations. But now, their inconsistency is simply information that they're not capable of the reliability you need from partnership. You receive this information and make decisions accordingly. You stop organizing your schedule around their uncertain availability. You make plans that don't depend on them showing up. You invest your energy in relationships and pursuits that actually reciprocate your investment. Their inconsistency informs you to protect yourself rather than hurting you into desperate pursuit. This shift includes experiencing their emotional unavailability as revelation rather than rejection. Previously, when the avoidant shut down emotionally or refused to engage with difficult conversations, you experienced it as them not caring enough about you to try, as evidence that you weren't important enough to merit their emotional presence. But now their emotional unavailability is information about their limitations, about their capacity for intimacy, about what they can and cannot provide in relationship. You receive this information and use it to decide whether you want to remain in relationship with someone whose emotional availability is this limited. The information doesn't hurt, it clarifies. It helps you see accurately what you're dealing with rather than hoping for something that doesn't exist. The patterns informing rather than hurting also manifest in your response to broken promises. Previously, when the avoidant promised change but didn't follow through, when they committed to showing up differently but reverted to old patterns, the disappointment was crushing. You wanted so desperately to believe them, invested hope in their promises, felt betrayed when behavior didn't match words. But now when they make promises about change, you hear them as aspirational statements rather than commitments you can depend on. You don't invest hope in their words. You observe their behavior over time and use that as the information that informs your decisions. If behavior changes, that's meaningful information. If it doesn't, that's equally meaningful information. Either way, you're making decisions based on demonstrated reality rather than on hope for transformation that may never materialize. This transformation includes experiencing their pattern of keeping you peripheral rather than integrated as information about their level of commitment, rather than as hurt about not being important enough. Previously, when the avoidant kept you separate from their friends, family, and life plans, it felt like rejection, like evidence that you weren't significant enough to integrate. But now their compartmentalization is simply information that they're not invested in building genuine partnership, that they're maintaining distance and optionality, that they're not ready for the kind of integrated life that healthy partnership requires. This information helps you decide whether you want to remain in a relationship where you're peripheral and the decision becomes practical rather than emotional. Does this meet my needs or not? rather than painful questioning of your worthiness to be central. The patterns informing decisions rather than causing hurt also appears in how you experience their need for multiple options. Previously, discovering or sensing that the avoidant maintained other connections, kept exes accessible, or otherwise ensured they had alternatives felt like devastating evidence that you weren't enough. But now their pattern of maintaining options is information about their fear of dependency, their inability to focus attachment on one person, their strategy for avoiding vulnerability. This information tells you they're not capable of the kind of focused, committed partnership you need. And you use that information to decide whether to continue accepting partial investment or to redirect your full investment towards someone capable of reciprocating it. The point of no return has been reached because hurt requires hope. You only hurt when you're still hoping they'll be different, when you're still invested in the relationship's potential, when their behavior still has the power to disappoint expectations you're holding. But when their patterns simply inform your decisions, it reveals you've released those hopes and expectations, that you've accepted them as they are rather than as you wish they would be, that you're making practical decisions about whether to stay or go based on reality rather than emotional decisions based on the gap between reality and hope. The avoidant might change after you've reached this point, might finally develop capacity for the consistency and presence you needed. But this potential change no longer moves you because you've already made peace with who they've consistently shown themselves to be. And the peace has brought you to a place where their transformation, if it even happens, comes too late to matter to your trajectory, which has already moved beyond them regardless of what they do next. You've built a life that doesn't include space for them. The third sign that you've reached the point of no return is when you've actively built a life, emotionally, practically, socially, that not only doesn't require the avoidant, but doesn't have obvious space for them anymore. This isn't about spite or deliberate exclusion. It's about the natural result of investing your energy in pursuits, relationships, and structures that actually serve you, filling the gaps the avoidance inconsistency created with things and people who show up reliably. When you've built this life and it functions well, when it brings satisfaction and stability, when returning to accommodate the avoidance patterns would require dismantling what you've constructed, you've reached a point where reunion isn't just emotionally unappealing, it's practically complicated in ways that make going backward feel impossible. This life without space for them manifests first in how you've structured your time and commitments. During the relationship, you likely kept your schedule flexible, left gaps for the avoidance, uncertain availability, maintained openness to their sporadic plans. But now your time is full with commitments that matter to you. Regular plans with friends who show up consistently, hobbies and activities you schedule, work projects you're invested in, personal practices that ground you. Your schedule isn't empty, waiting for the avoidant to decide they want to see you. It's genuinely full with your own life, and accommodating the avoidant would require canceling things that have become important, disappointing people who've proven reliable, disrupting routines that serve your well-being. The practical reality of your full life creates natural barriers to the avoidance re-entry. The life you've built also includes emotional investments in relationships that have filled the space the avoidant occupied. You've deepened friendships that were neglected during the relationship when your emotional energy focused primarily on the avoidant. You've developed new connections with people who reciprocate your investment. You might be dating someone new who shows up consistently in ways the avoidant never did. These relationships aren't placeholders while you wait for the avoidant to return. They're genuine connections that provide real fulfillment, that meet needs the avoidant couldn't meet, that demonstrate what healthy, reciprocal relationship actually feels like. Returning to the avoidant would mean either abandoning or significantly reducing investment in these relationships that have proven their value through their presence during the period when the avoidant was absent. This life without space also includes the emotional structure you've built, that doesn't depend on the avoidance, validation, or presence. You've developed sources of self-worth that come from within rather than from their inconsistent affirmation. You've created practices, therapy, meditation, journaling, creative expression that help you process emotions and maintain stability, independent of anyone else's behavior. You've cultivated a sense of self that's whole, rather than defined by your relationship status or by whether the avoidant chooses you. This emotional infrastructure that you've worked hard to build would be threatened by allowing the avoidant back into centrality in your life, by returning to a dynamic where your emotional state fluctuates with their availability, by risking the stability you've achieved for the chaos their patterns create. The life you've built also includes practical changes that would complicate the avoidance return. You might have moved to a new place that better suits your life without them. You might have accepted a job opportunity you wouldn't have accepted if you were still prioritizing the relationship. You might have made financial decisions, adopted commitments, or established living arrangements that assume your continued independence. These practical changes aren't easily undone, and they represent investments in a future that doesn't include the avoidant. Accommodating their return would require reversing decisions you made to serve yourself, sacrificing opportunities you pursued precisely because you were no longer constrained by a relationship that wasn't working. This life without space for them includes the narrative you've constructed about who you are and where you're going, that no longer features them as a central character. During the relationship, your story likely revolved significantly around them, your hopes for the relationship, your work to make it function, your identity as their partner. But now your narrative centers on yourself, your growth, your goals, your journey toward the life you want, your relationships with people who enhance rather than complicate your well-being. The story you tell yourself about your life is one of moving forward, of healing, of building something better. The avoidant returning would interrupt this narrative, would require you to rewrite your story again to accommodate someone who's already been written out, whose absence has been integrated into your understanding of who you're becoming and where you're headed. The life you've built also includes clear boundaries and standards that emerge from your experience with the avoidant, standards that the avoidant, as they've demonstrated themselves to be, cannot meet. You've learned what you need from partnership, consistency, emotional availability, integration into each other's lives, mutual prioritization. You've committed to these standards not as abstract ideals, but as requirements you won't compromise again. The life you've built is structured around these standards, around relationships and pursuits that meet them. The avoidant returning would either require them to have transformed enough to meet your standards, which is possible but unlikely based on their track record, or would require you to lower your standards again to make space for patterns you've decided you won't accept anymore. The former seems improbable, the latter feels like betraying the growth you've achieved and the commitment you've made to yourself. The point of no return has been reached because the life you've built isn't something you want to disrupt or dismantle. It isn't something you're maintaining reluctantly while secretly hoping the avoidant will return so you can abandon it. You're genuinely satisfied with this life, genuinely invested in the people and pursuits that fill it, genuinely committed to the trajectory you're on. The avoidance return would be an intrusion into something that works rather than a solution to something that's broken, a complication to something stable rather than a restoration of something you're missing. You've reached the point of no return, not because you've locked the door against them out of hurt, but because you've built a home in your life that feels right as it is, that doesn't have an empty room waiting for them to occupy. That would require significant dismantling to accommodate someone whose patterns once caused you to need precisely the stability and fullness you've now achieved without them. The thought of reconciliation feels like regression rather than hope. The fourth, and perhaps most psychologically significant sign that you've reached the point of no return is when the thought of reconciling with the avoidant feels like regression, like moving backward, like undoing growth, like returning to a version of yourself you've worked hard to evolve beyond, rather than like the hopeful reunion it once would have represented. This shift from experiencing their potential return as desired outcome to experiencing it as unwanted complication reveals that you've completed a transformation where the relationship isn't something you're trying to preserve or restore, but something you've genuinely outgrown, where going back would require shrinking into a smaller version of yourself that no longer fits who you've become. This feeling of regression manifests first in recognizing that reconciliation would require you to accommodate patterns you've learned to live without. During the relationship, you adjusted yourself constantly to work around the avoidance limitations, suppressing needs they couldn't meet, accepting inconsistency as normal, tolerating emotional unavailability as the cost of being with them. But you spent time since separation or distance learning to live without making those accommodations. Learning that you can have needs and express them without constant self-editing, that you can expect consistency and receive it from people capable of providing it. Returning to the avoidant would mean returning to those accommodations, and that return feels like betraying yourself, like choosing their comfort over your well-being again after you've learned that you don't have to make that choice. The thought of reconciliation feeling like regression also includes recognizing that you've processed and released the hope that kept you tethered, and reclaiming that hope would require unlearning the acceptance you've achieved. You went through grief about the relationship ending or changing, grief about the future you imagined not materializing, grief about the person you hoped the avoidant would become never emerging. That grief was painful, but it was also productive. It moved you from hope into acceptance, from fantasy into reality, from waiting into living. Reconciliation would require reanimating hope you've properly mourned and released, would require believing again in potential you've accepted won't be realized, would require investing again in a future you've grieved and moved past. This resurrection of dead hope feels like regression because you've already done the hard work of letting it go. The feeling of regression includes recognizing that the version of yourself who could be in relationship with the avoidant is a version you've outgrown. During the relationship, you were someone who accepted breadcrumbs, who waited patiently through withdrawal, who believed love meant endless accommodation, but you've evolved into someone with stronger boundaries, clearer standards, deeper understanding of what you deserve from partnership. The person you were during the relationship couldn't have left or created distance. They were too invested in making it work at any cost. The person you've become can leave, has left, doesn't need to return. Reconciliation would require reverting to the old version because the new version of you isn't compatible with the relationship structure the avoidant offers. Going back feels like regression because it would mean becoming again someone you've worked hard to stop being. The thought of reconciliation as regression also manifests in recognizing that you've learned lessons from this relationship that reconciliation would require you to unlearn or ignore. You've learned that consistency matters, that patterns predict future behavior better than promises do, that avoidant attachment doesn't change without serious, sustained work, that love without healthy relationship structure isn't enough. These lessons were hard-won, emerged from pain and disappointment, represent wisdom you've integrated. Reconciling with the avoidant, especially if they haven't done visible, transformative work, would require ignoring these lessons, pretending you don't know what you know, acting against the wisdom you've developed. This willful ignorance of your own growth feels like regression because it would require you to become less wise, less aware, less protective of yourself than you've learned to be. The feeling of regression includes recognizing that your growth happened because of distance from the relationship, and returning to proximity would likely stall or reverse that growth. In separation or distance, you've become more yourself, more confident, more clear about your needs, more willing to prioritize your well-being, more connected to your own worth, independent of whether someone else chooses you. This growth required space from the relationship's dynamics, freedom from constant accommodation, distance from the anxiety that the avoidance patterns created. Returning to proximity, especially if the avoidance patterns haven't fundamentally changed, would likely recreate the conditions that prevented your growth before, would pull you back into old dynamics that required you to be less than your full self, would demand the accommodations and suppression that kept you small. The growth you've achieved feels precious enough that risking it for reconciliation seems like a poor trade. The thought of reconciliation as regression also includes recognizing that you've established a life trajectory that's forward moving, that's taking you toward the future you want, and that reconciliation would divert you from that path. You have clarity now about what you want from life, from partnership, from your future. You're taking steps toward those goals, making decisions aligned with your values, building the life you've envisioned. The avoidant and the relationship they offer don't fit into this trajectory. They represent a detour back to something you've already experienced and found insufficient. Reconciliation would mean abandoning or postponing the path you're on, redirecting energy back toward making a dysfunctional relationship work rather than continuing to invest in creating the life you actually want. This diversion from your forward momentum feels like regression because it would mean choosing to return to something that already didn't work instead of continuing towards something that might. The feeling of regression includes recognizing that reconciliation would require reestablishing trust that was broken, rebuilding investment that was depleted, reopening to vulnerability that led to hurt. You've done the work of protecting yourself, of closing off vulnerability that wasn't met with care, of withdrawing investment that wasn't reciprocated, of releasing trust that was repeatedly violated. These protective measures were necessary for your healing, and they've served you well. Reconciliation would require reversing this protection, becoming vulnerable again to patterns that hurt you before, trusting again someone whose track record doesn't warrant trust, investing again in something that gave insufficient return. This reopening of closed wounds, this re-extending of withdrawn trust, this reinvestment of depleted energy, all of it feels like regression because you've already done the painful work of withdrawing these things, and you'd have to undo that work to give the relationship another chance. The point of no return has been reached because regression, moving backward, holds no appeal when you're satisfied with the direction you're moving forward. You're not stuck, not stagnant, not waiting for the avoidant to return so your life can resume. You're actively building, growing, healing, moving toward a future that excites you. The avoidance return isn't experienced as an opportunity, but as a potential obstacle to the momentum you've built, as a temptation to abandon the growth you've achieved for the familiar comfort of patterns you've outgrown. When reconciliation feels like regression rather than hope, when going back feels like betraying yourself rather than giving love another chance, when the relationship represents your past rather than your future, you've reached the point where no amount of change from the avoidant is likely to pull you back because you've fundamentally changed in ways that make you incompatible with the relationship you once desperately tried to preserve. The point of no return isn't about the door being locked. It's about you having walked so far down a different path that turning back would require abandoning the journey you're on, and that journey matters to you more now than the relationship you've left behind.